I'm Randy Oksher. I am the Vice President and Treasurer of the American Institute of Philosophical and Cultural Thought. And I also live in this house. The President of the Institute of American Philosophical and Cultural Thought talked me into using our house to house an archive of many thousands of books and interesting papers, and with the mission of forwarding the history, present, and future of American thought, broadly construed to include culture, and anybody who's interested in what we think is welcome here. But the we can be understood as broadly as you wish. Woodrow Wilson said that to be an American is not to be born on these shores, but to embrace the ideals. Now, I don't embrace the same ideals as Woodrow Wilson, although some of them, there's some overlap. But the point is that the interest in American thought as our mission and pushing into the public domain this particular collection of ideas is done because we think it makes the world at least a more thoughtful, if not necessarily a better place. So that said, that's our mission. For some of you, this is the first time you've been here. Some folks have been here many times. There are a number of fellows of the AIPCT. My co-director, Larry Hickman, is here. We have fellows in Nick Guardiano and Robert Fiedler, senior fellow Ken Stickers, Les Murray, Brian Stanfield, Sabrina Hardenberg, Katrina Colombo, all back there, fellows of the AIPCT. And so they help us and they support us in these programs that we put on. And you say, programs that you put on? Do you put on programs? Yes, we do. So there's a Alfred North Whitehead reading group on Wednesdays. It began last week, but it's not too late to join. And that's a pretty serious read of Process and Reality, and we're going to meet every Wednesday until May 4th. You can go out to the website and see what the reading schedule is. March 5th through 7th, we have the Creativity Conferences, and our topic this year is personal objects, the way in which culture turns objects into persons. That's the topic. And 3 keynote speeches, one from a Native American specialist, one from a philosophy of religion and religion scholar, and a third from a cognitive scientist, looking all at these problems and these questions of personal objects. And so that'll be March 5th through 7th. We have visiting fellows coming from Italy, one from the University of Palermo for the whole month of February, one from the University of Rome for the whole month of March. And it is not too late to apply for the dissertation fellowship, to be in this house and study for the months of June and July and finish a dissertation chapter. It's a dissertation fellowship. This is all paid for by the Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity. And so if you go to our website, you will find all of this information. And I think, well, I know that each of our resident fellows will be giving a paper at the end of March, at the end of February, and generally speaking, when people spend some time in this place, they go to the special collections at Morris Library, they do some research, they spend time here, and then they speak to us. However, our speaker tonight is someone who is not going to be able to stay with us more than, well, you're here 4 days. That's, well, parts of 4 days.
3 days.
Over the course, well, you got here Sunday. Then there was Monday. Then there was Tuesday. That's today. And you're not leaving until late tomorrow afternoon. I count that as 4 days. so anyway. And her tour of the United States is sponsored, at least in part, by the French Embassy. So I didn't get to communicate with Barbara because it was all mediated by the French Embassy until she showed up. And then it turns out that she's not a French Embassy person at all. She's like one of us. And so anyway, I was a little worried because the French Embassy is a very formal organization. They wanted all the details. It's like, how are you going to take care of her? What is she? And I said, well, what are her dietary restrictions? Turned out none. All right, so then I'm going to take care of her very well indeed. So Barbara is on a tour. It's over 3 weeks. That's a full month.
No.
Almost.
Quasi 3 weeks.
It's 3 weeks. And she's been to Chicago, she's been to Norfolk, she's been to Philadelphia, she's going to New York, she's going to New Haven, and then eventually home. And one of the things that she's doing is and I have to say this, it's the night of ideas. The Alliance Française and the French government combined to create this thing that I didn't know about because I live in the middle of nowhere, called the Night of Ideas. And they bring all sorts of French intellectuals and cultural figures to other countries, but in the U.S., the Night of Ideas, and you'll be doing it in Brooklyn, and you already did it in Chicago.
I will do it in Chicago.
Oh, you haven't done it yet.
And I've done it in Norfolk.
In Norfolk.
Yeah.
So they bring the French to us, and the stuff is all online, and you can watch it, and lots of people show up. And I think the idea is to create understanding, cultural exchange, and goodwill between France and the United States. And so that's actually, that and her new book, One Must Adapt, or We Must Adapt, is what brings Barbara to our shores for this particular evening. She is a professor, I trusted her embassy, and I shouldn't have done that. It said associate professor of philosophy. They were wrong. They don't know who you are. Or they're angry at you. Anyway, so she's a professor of philosophy at the University of Bordeaux, and in particular specializing in political philosophy. And from what she's taught my students this morning, I have to say you're in for a real treat, because I learned lots and lots of stuff that I hadn't known before. So without further delay, Barbara Stiegler from the University of Bordeaux.
Thank you.
Thank you for your invitation. It's wonderful to be here. And I'm so well accueilli by you in your house. Thank you. I have hesitate for the talk because that's many technical things, but I prefer to present in a different way the talk of the Night of Ideas, in fact, because it's the most clear, in fact, that I have. So the title is Life After the Collapse of Neoliberalism. The title is a little bit shocking, but, and the subtitle is Coming Alive Again. And I would like to explain to you why I work now on Dewey and on this Dewey-Lippmann debate. And to explain this, I will not speak about Dewey during several minutes, but I will speak about the situation, the political situation now. I think that one of the fundamental forces of neoliberalism comes from the fact that it speaks of life, and that it speaks to us as living beings. I explain this. Over the past half century, it has repeatedly told us that evolution calls for changes that allow us to survive and adapt to a new environment, that's the word, that is now unstable, complex, and unreliable. This is its lexicon, which comes entirely from biology and sciences of life. Evolution, selection, adaptation, mutation, competition. Being alive in such a world requires us to be flexible and adaptable, to be open to the constant, ever faster transformations in a world which is supposed to be without any closures, any borders, any stasis, and any status. This is supposed to be the meaning of life and the inevitable goal of evolution. It is supposed to be the telos in Greek of evolution. the fulfillment, the telos is the fulfillment of what is commonly referred to as globalization, in fact. This is, according to neoliberalism, the direction of the history of life, to accomplish the work division and all the processes of exchanges, commercial, cultural, and so on, at the scale of the world. To realize the big open game of competition and cooperation, which was exactly announced by the liberal and evolutionist utopist Herbert Spencer at the end of the 19th century. But we have to be aware of one thing. Here is an important distinction that must be made with Spencer. What neoliberalism promises, and this is what differentiates it from dominant ultraliberalism, it's very important to do this distinction between neoliberalism and what I call ultraliberalism. Ultraliberalism imposes deregulated capitalism. Neoliberalism wants a just or a fair play form of globalization. That's a very profound difference. The utopia of neoliberalism is a rule-based globalization favoring the advent of a large open world where fair competition means that the best are rewarded while the worst are eliminated. Not the strongest, the best. It's not the same thing. That was indeed the neoliberal vision underpinning the speech given last November by Monsieur Antoine Petit, who is president and CEO, we say like this now, of the CNRS, Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, the French Institute of Research, when he spoke in honor of the French Research Institute for its 80-year anniversary. He announced a new law to govern research, a law which will be put to the vote in January and February now. And he promised a, I quote, Darwinian law. A Darwinian law which would bring the university and French research into the game of global and fair competition. A law in which the state itself is supposed to eliminate the worst of us. So funny, but it's true. So, as I said to begin my talk, the force of neoliberalism is that it tells a story about the history of life, and that it talks to us as living beings. We have to adapt, we have to evolve, there are mutation, and so on. However, its huge problem is that the current ecological crisis reminds us that life itself has its own conditions, and that those conditions are incompatible with globalization and the concomitant explosion of all mobilities, even the mobilities of scholars, you know, thus disqualifying the narrative, the grand récit, as we say in French, of neoliberalism. Coming up against the finite nature of vital resources and discovering the urgent need to respect living conditions and the condition of living beings, whether the conditions are those of ecosystems or of our vital forces in relation to work, in relation to education, in relation to health, neoliberalism seems today to have begun a long process of collapse. That's That is my conviction. And this is why it is now being challenged everywhere in the world. Not just by the working classes who elected Donald Trump or voted for Brexit, but also now by the intellectual professions who no longer believe in the neoliberal vision itself. After several decades of a passive consent, they have now some doubts, and they even begin to refuse, through big demonstrations, strikes, and social mobilizations, they even begin to refuse the neoliberal project itself. As a consequence of this, some have begun to ask themselves questions. If this collapse not likely to mark the end of our, is this collapse mark the end of our democratic states? As long as there is no clear alternative giving us another direction, another program, or another credible plan, is it not preferable in the meantime to submit to the order in place rather than taking the risk of accelerating the fall of neoliberal order and contributing to chaos? Others, like me, argue the opposite. On the contrary, this process of collapse gives us the historic opportunity and the duty to reinvent the very roots of our democracies by completely rethinking our ways of life, here and now. And this is precisely the meaning of the current mobilizations. The idea is not to invent a new plan to impose to the peoples all over the world. It is not to replace the neoliberal agenda by another agenda. The idea is to transform radically our ways of life, here and now, in our universities, in our schools, in our hospitals, in our towns and neighborhoods, in order to make them compatible with the conditions of the life itself. That is my analysis of what is going now, this year and last year. But what I discovered a few years ago is that this alternative was not entirely new. In this book, my latest book, in Il faut s'adapter, We Must Adapt, I revisited the American roots of this debate. In the book, I explained that it was already emerging in an old, forgotten discussion held in the 1920s and the 1930s between two great Americans that you know, the political theorist Walter Lippmann and the philosopher John Dewey. I reconstructed the exciting discussion between these two great figures. I found it worthy of a 1930s thriller, American thriller, you know, and which played out extensively between New York and Chicago. And that's why I'm very glad to be in New York and Chicago, because this is the place of my book, in fact. And the idea was to better understand what is happening to us, to me, today. It was the idea. In fact, it is the genealogical method, which was theorized by Michel Foucault, to go to the past to understand the present and to have an ontology of ourselves. And this idea of genealogy, Foucault has found it in Nietzsche. Genealogy of morals. We are studying the past, not for nothing, but to understand the problem we have. So it was exactly a genealogical inquiry. A genealogy is dangerous because when you are in a genealogical inquiry, you can always reconstruct the past and have sort of illusions, you know, of course. I recognize in the Lippmann-Dewey debate the same conflict between those who want now, like Lippmann, to maintain of all cost and even by force the course set by classical liberalism dating back to Adam Smith with the global expansion of markets, and those who affirm, like Dewey, the necessity to transform ourselves and at the root our ways of life. Way of life is an expression very important in Dewey, as you know. In order to liberate them, those way of life, from the iron cage of global capitalism and to make them compatible with the evolution of life itself. For me, it's exactly the conflict that we have now in France and everywhere. The new genealogy of neoliberalism that I propose in the book takes as its starting point, as all the other serious, exactly as the other serious academic interpretations, it's not original at all, the centrality of Walter Lippmann's work, a work which inspired the 1938 symposium held in Paris, the famous Lippmann Conference, Lippmann Colloquium, which marks the historical birth of neoliberalism, which launched the neoliberalism. The originality of my investigation is not this. The originality is to have shown everything that new liberalism owed to the theory of evolution. Michel Foucault, who was the first philosopher to produce a philosophical analysis of neoliberalism, left this crucial point out for reasons that I do not have time to go into here. What I have shown is that Lippmann's neoliberalism was the result of lengthy political meditation on the new situation of the human race, I quote, which was judged to be completely unprecedented in the history of life by Lippmann. That his initial observation was one of a profound lack of adaptation between the natural disposition of our species, inherited from our very long evolutionary history, and the demands of our new environment, the environment created by industrial revolution, brutally imposed to us, and we are not prepared to that. It is Lippmann's analysis. This observation is at the heart of all Lippmann's political work. Its question is, how can the human race, the human species, readapt to an unstable and open environment when all its evolutionary history has adapted it to a stable and relatively closed environment? From the rural community to the Greek city-state. You remember the question of Aristotle of the limit of the state. The state has to be small, otherwise it's not possible to live politically normally. How can its vital and natural need, the vital and natural need of our species for stasis and for closure, be articulated with the accelerated fluidification of all exchanges and the destruction of all borders imposed by globalization? That's the Lippmannian question. At what pace should the human species be reformed so as to articulate its slow evolutionary history with the new demands of the great industrial revolution? So the question is, how can we prevent this new tension between what I call flux in my vocabulary, flux and stasis, openness and enclosure? How can we prevent this new tension contributing on the side of the masses, that is the vocabulary of Lippmann, to a rise in nationalisms, fascisms, and more generally all forms of withdrawal that go against evolution and whose aim is to restore the stasis and reinforce the enclosures? This question, very current, I think, was the starting point of Lippmann and of the neoliberal program. And it was always, in a certain way, the starting point of the John Dewey's political thought. In fact, Lippmann and Dewey have found this question in Graham Wallas, this British social psychologist, very important, who gave a seminar in Harvard in 1913, which was very important for Lippmann and for Dewey. And they read the very important book. The name is The Great Society. Okay, so this is the common matrix of Lippmann and Dewey, and it is the starting point of the Lippmann-Dewey debate. The question. John Dewey was trying to understand, exactly like Lippmann, the political consequences of the Darwinian revolution in the context of the industrial revolution, double revolution, Darwinian and industrial revolution. However, the fascinating side of their debate is that they drew from this common starting point some conclusion not only diverse, but radically opposite. So, same diagnosis, but the therapy is totally opposite. Lippmann and all the neoliberals after him theorize a mode of government that combines the knowledge of experts, who play a central role in his political model, and the artifices of the law, the rules of the game. Charged to create the conditions of a market regulated by fair and loyal rules and with agents, us, that are able to have the good comportments, the good behaviors on this market. Lippmann do not hesitate to call the policy to transform population itself in order to readapt it with the help of powerful public policies in education and health and eugenics. Dewey, on the contrary, only recognizes genuinely political experimentation if it is led, as you know, by the collective intelligence of what he calls the publics. What are publics? You know that, but I have to remind it. Publics are provisional and unstable collectives suffering from a common problem and seeking to solve it together through democratic experimentation, itself inseparable from the affective dimension of any experience. This point is very important. For Lippmann and for American neoliberals in general, allocating this role of social transformation to the supposed intelligence of the publics was totally absurd. It was to deny the reality of evolutionary processes, in view of which the affectivity of the masses and the human intelligence appear as rigid, backward, and inadequate. But for Dewey and pragmatists, on the contrary, it is this joint interpretation of affectivity and collective intelligence as a functional supervisory body that comes as close as possible to Darwin's logic. For Lippmann and the neoliberals, collective intelligence is the ability to planification, that, because it denies the reality of evolution, must be switched off, mise hors circuit in French, like epoche in phenomenology, to switch off this intelligence. And this collective intelligence can only lead to the horrors of collectivism. For Dewey and the pragmatists, on the contrary, it is the organ par excellence of readjustment, which knows how to withstand, how to articulate the irreducible tension between the flux of novelty and the stasis of the old, especially in Human Nature and Conduct, this fantastic book, allowing it to pass on the evolutionary logic of the living while at the same time amplifying the logic of evolution. Of this long debate between Lippmann and Dewey, American history has mainly focused on the conflict about democracy during the 1920s, and which resurfaced in contemporary America in the 2000s, after the world of the la guerre du Golfe, after la guerre du Golfe, after the Gulf War. Yes. Yeah. Pitting defenders of representative democracy governed from the top down by experts, Lippmann, against those in favor of participative democracy and participative media, promoting the continued involvement of citizens in collective experimentation in Dewey. It was, as you know, certainly a debate in the communication studies, in fact. And you have also the role of Noam Chomsky and so on. It was the context of the crisis of media. Okay. However, by showing that the famous Lippmann-Dewey debate was of much greater importance, since it linked the question of the future of democracy to that of the future of liberalism, because Dewey is for a new liberalism, totally opposite, while rethinking them in the light of the Darwinian revolution. The new genealogy of neoliberalism that I reconstruct here reveals that John Dewey political thought was the first great philosophical critique of neoliberalism. In fact, that's my opinion. It's crazy. In fact, we had this first philosophical critique and we don't use it. So I think that it is therefore vital and urgent that we should seize this opportunity to test its critical power, and its ability to radically renew our democracies. My political hypothesis is that we have to test Dewey. Dewey is not my God. We have to test him in an experimental way, here and now, in order to measure its forces and also eventually its limits. This book ventures that there is, in this Lippmannian diagnosis of the maladjustment of the human species and in the neoliberal disqualification of the intelligence of the public, reduced to the status of inept masses who should be taken in hand from above, something that could shed light on the current and diffuse feeling of being perpetually behind or lagging, constantly implied by the world's leaders. Orders to adapt, to catch up, to speed up our rhythms, to snap out of inertia and to guard against any future slowdown, the general discredit of all forms of stasis in the name of flux, the value of flexibility and adaptability in all fields of life, find here perhaps their most powerful sources, and at the same time the most ambivalent of legitimization. And their strength is probably due to their roots, which are not be found in some abstract economic theory, as we usually say, the economic theory of rational choice or the neoclassical economics, as I spoke this morning. That's not it. Neoliberalism is more powerful because it is a concession of life, of the living, of evolution, and of the direction of history, of human history and of history of life. That's what is so powerful. However, in this respect, the political conflict between Lippmann and Dewey also opens a gap into which it seems urgent to rush in order to renew the question of the relationship between flux and stasis. I love this question of flux and stasis because it is the Nietzschean question. So I am in my, what is lagging in the human species and what are the causes this lagging behind? Should we believe that it is its inherent dispositions, our inherent dispositions, that are lagging behind the industrial environment, as Lippmann argues? Or is it not rather the industrial environment itself, which has become sclerotic and degraded under the impact of capitalism and its relentless battle for domination, that is delaying the potential of our species, as Dewey thought? The question is whether neoliberalism is right to want to liquefy all stasis in the name of flux, or whether the tension between flux and stasis and with it the multiplication of situations where rhythms clash with one another are not, like tension and conflict, constitutive of life itself. If this is the case, the field of politics should be completely rethought to be able to confront not only the conflict of interests, as think liberals, not only the struggle of classes, as think Marxism, but also the divergence and the conflict of evolutionary rhythms that structure any living community. I think it's a real new way to think politically the situation. In a neoliberal world where everyone has to go in the same direction and at the same pace, there can be no conflict. And there can be no negative. This is what motivates the constant disqualification of the negative, of criticism, and the permanent appreciation of benevolence, that is bienveillance in French language. Our neoliberal president, Emmanuel Macron, speaks every day about bienveillance, only pure positivity. Positive attitude to change. The innate conflict of politics and democracy is replaced by an old archaic power, perfectly described by Kant in What Are Enlightenments? What is enlightenments? Enlightenments, sorry. That of looking after, bien veiller sur, the man as the shepherd watches over a herd. When you have resistance of the herd, the only remaining way is vertical, relying on condescension and punishment. Because in a neoliberal world, the conflict do not exist in politics. Instead of assuming conflict, neoliberalism depicts a gap between those who know and the blind mass of all those who resist change, because they are archaic. Today in France, it is this depiction that invades our TV screens, whilst at the same time unraveling before our very eyes. Why? Because as knowledge-based professions such as doctors, teachers, researchers, in short, those previously called scientists or intellectuals, join the mobilization, the scenario no longer holds up. It's very complicated to maintain this scenario of the inept mass and the experts when you have mobilization of intellectual professions. I don't want to overestimate our power, but we have a power to complicate the situation. That's a good news. I'm going to conclude by telling you how I feel about what has been going on in my country, France, since November 17th, when the famous yellow jackets took to the stage. My firm conviction is that since that date, we have witnessed and are indeed still witnessing an unprecedented popular insurrection, which is, as we speak, taking on new forms and new colors, not only yellow, red, green, and so on, with the massive demonstration by the health and education professions against the pension reform defended by the French government. In every one of the government projects, we can find the markers of neoliberalism and its conception of the future. It's very clear. There is no debate on this subject, in fact. In the case of pension reform, for example, the idea is to impose the same narrative on the future of our lives, that of an ever longer life expectancy, in which work and competition will indefinitely reduce death and ever more triumph with justice and equal opportunities in the great global game of capitalization. We have to capitalize points and we have to capitalize a pension fund, you know. And it is a great game, and the idea is to give equality of opportunity in this great competitive game. At a time when our neoliberal system is collapsing, this utopic way of thinking is faced with a completely different reality. At a time of ecological crisis and the degradation of our ways of life, international reports on public health announce a completely different scenario, that of an explosion of chronic diseases that will violently contradict the neoliberal narrative about life and health. It is certainly this counter-diagnosis that explains the powerful challenge neoliberalism faces today. Rather than adapting our lives to the needs of an environment harmed by globalization, it is the resources of our ecosystems, our bodies, and our minds, in short, our living conditions, that we must now adapt. It's totally diverse. Even experts and leaders can no longer know the course, the hand, in advance. Since it is our living conditions here and now that must be our starting point, it is up to our collective intelligence to take over from evolution and collectively invent other ways of living, other ways of life. John Dewey warned us, only then will we live up to the expectation of that great laboratory of life that Darwin so well described in The Origin of the Species, that of a multiple and a vigorous evolution about which no one can decree in advance the meaning and the purpose. That's my rereading of Lippmann and Dewey debate today. Thank you for your attention.
I'm quite sure that Professor Stiegler is capable of handling her own questions. I turn it over to you.
Yes.
Do you think, I don't know how much you know about American politics or elections, but when Hillary Clinton was candidate, she called Donald Trump supporters deplorables.
Mm-hmm. I
Is
remember.
that an example of one
Absolutely.
of the problems with neoliberalism?
Absolutely. I don't know very well Hillary Clinton program, but it's clear for me that she's totally neoliberal.
Mhm.
She's totally neoliberal because she has this idea of justice, fair competition, fair globalization, public policies in education, in health, with great ambition to readapt America to the globalization, and with this discourse of justice, which is a very important marker of neoliberalism, and it's great difference with ultraliberalism. Ultraliberalism has absolutely not no discourse about justice, only force. So yes, I think it's totally symptomatic. We know experts and leaders, we know the way, we know, and the masses are archaic, and this reaction of riot are totally typical of masses and inertia of masses.
Come now, Ken. I know, I can just see. You've got so many questions.
Just to formulate the question.
Yeah. Well, I am reconverted to Dewey as a result of hearing Barbara talk in the last couple of days.
Oh.
I had forgotten how good he was.
Thank you.
I mean, it's been a while since I visited these ideas, and I never saw it as a critique of neoliberalism. But it is. And I begin to realize how much I do agree with Dewey, and that he foresaw the crap I hate. and that he already had a response to it that looks viable to me. So.
Thank you very much.
No, but I mean, I read all that stuff, but I had forgotten how good it was.
I don't know if I have a question yet, but I mean, Dewey does. But Dewey does embrace the notion of liberal, but in a reconstructed,
liberalism,
in
of
a
course.
reconstructed
Yeah,
way.
exactly.
But it's been a while since I read the liberalism collection. But the main critique, though, is really it's hypocrisy, isn't it?
Is?
The hypocrisy. That is, he's criticizing liberals for their
Hypocrisy.
lofty language and so forth.
Hypocrisy?
The contradiction between speech and action.
Ah, yes.
And so he's criticizing them for their hypocrisy to have these lofty ideas of fairness and humaneness and so forth, but not fully acting on
It's
them.
true. The division of being with the discourse and the action, of course.
Yeah. So I guess I was curious of how you would characterize or how you understand Dewey's embrace and reconstruction
Liberalism?
of the notion of liberalism.
Yeah. He clearly wants to reconstruct liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
What he loves in liberalism is the question of impulse. The possibility that every newborn in the species has something to, has this natural tendency to do deviation.
Yeah.
And that is fantastic and dangerous. So when you educate someone, you have to control this deviation tendency of the kids, of course, but if you destroy this tendency, everything is over.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there is this tragic tension between old and new, between the routine or the habits. The habits are not a routine, but you see what I mean, and the divergence. And every newborn has this divergence power, and it is the question of education. And I think that for Dewey, what is fantastic in liberalism is this attention to the impulse that every individual have in himself. So the idea is to preserve this, but to do a critique of the liberalism, the history of liberalism, which was always atomized, individualist in a wrong way. So that is my answer. But in this book, I have made chapters on this Jewish liberalism, which is a very complicated question. But I think I can understand him. And maybe I am liberal also. in this way.
One of the things that Lippmann and Dewey debated, I think, had to do with the degree of participation in politics. In 2007, there was a book published by, I think his name was Adam Kaplan, and he was basically reviving an argument that was presented by Lippmann in the 1930s, which is that we should restrict voting to people who are intelligent. Of course, if we can find them. And that the government should basically be run by experts. And there should be two parties. And you should just vote for whichever party is not getting it wrong at a certain point. That was basically, I think, Lippmann's point, and it was also Kaplan's point in 2007. But I want to present three arguments that Dewey made against Lippmann and see if you think that they hit the mark. The first was that if you thought that the, quote, masses, end quote, term that I don't think Dewey ever used because he was smarter than that. If you think they're just really stupid and unable to deal with the responsibilities of voting, then even those experts who are aligned with the government, they're not going to be able to control them anyway. So what's the point? The second argument involved two pieces. The first was a kind of mild exclusionary argument that said you have to be very careful with so-called democratic forces that tend to get into power and then take up all the space, so there's no space for democracy. Some people call this streetcar Democrats. They get on the streetcar and then they get off at the next stop. No more democracy, right? We've seen this in Europe. We've seen it here as well. In fact, right now. But he suggested that you have to avoid those people. In fact, he had a big problem with the American Communist Party over this very issue. That is a mild exclusionary argument. But then the big thing comes when he says, what are we going to do about all this? And that is an inclusionary argument that says you've got to go back to the basis, and more democracy means more education.
Exactly.
So he's going right to the roots of it. So my question, it may not sound like I have a question here because I've talked so long, but my question is, do you think that these arguments were adequate or forceful enough in terms of his response to Lippmann?
The first argument.
The first argument had to do with the nature of the, quote, masses. That is, if they're so stupid, ignorant, and unruly,
You have to limit
then they're not going to be governable at all. So what's the point of having these experts advising the government on how to do it without their vote?
Yeah, I think, yes, but I think Dewey was impressed by Lippmann. For example, the idea that we have to readapt the human race led Lippmann to imagine public policies very ambitious to transform the species. So Lippmann, is the third question also, has a theory of education. We don't have to abandon education to private sphere. On the contrary, education is one of the most important things for a neoliberal state. And it's true. And the idea is to transform totally this maladjusted species in a species which will be good fit, good adapted to the globalization and acceleration. So Dewey was very impressed by those arguments, which are different than restrict the right to vote, and which are frightening, in fact. And he spoke about education and health, to the idea of enhancement, to increase the performance of the species and to use eugenics politics. It always is in the inquiry into the good society, the book which launched the neoliberal colloque. So Dewey was very impressed by all those arguments, more in the 1930s than in the 1920s. And he answered on this, and for this he has a conflict with Lippmann on the question of what is evolution, what is life, what Darwin told us. You know, so it's another level than the question of how can we manipulate or control the vote of the Trumpist people. It's a higher level which is on the future of the human race, of the human species. You understand?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I was mainly focused on this, the future of our species, the future of life, the question of evolution, rather than the strategic question of the manipulation of the votes and so on. I'm not sure.
If you pardon me, a statement without a question. It strikes me that liberalism and social action, that book, really has to be read with individualism over new.
Yeah.
Because for Dewey, the old liberalism said that we are already individuals.
Mm.
And for Dewey, no, that's not right. It's that we become individuals through educational processes and through cultural contexts that are required by a good democratic society. There's no question there, it's just a concept.
Yeah, the two books are Liberalism and Social Action and Liberalism Old and New.
Yeah.
The question of liberalism with Dewey.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions for our speaker? You have another. But of course.
Now they're really starting to form here.
Yeah, actually. Well, it's a lot of
I have to
information.
be selective, yeah. So if I could ask two rather different questions. What I have found most relevant in Lippmann is that he seems to be very concerned with the situation that's very much with us today, and that is how democracies give rise to authoritarian regimes.
Exactly.
How is it that the masses can overthrow their own democracy?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I guess that'd be question number one. To what extent do you see that as one of the important things that we can take away from Lippmann? I see him as one of the first to that. The other question is much more broadly, and I'm just kind of curious how you understand then the history of the idea of liberalism. My own understanding is that the liberal-conservative divide grows out of the debates over the American-French Revolution, especially between Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke and Robespierre on the other hand. And as I understand the debate, the heart of it was what is the relationship. Well, back up a little bit, that liberalism then initially simply meant that human liberty was an intrinsic good. And that was all. Over against somebody like Burke, it was an argument about the relationship between liberty and virtue. Burke's argument was that only the virtuous deserve liberty. Paine's counter-argument was that only those with liberty can be virtuous, as I understand it, and so the debate went. So I'm just curious what you understand is the origin of the history of that concept.
Yeah, for the second question, the American background of the debate was in the book is entirely focused on Jefferson and Madison.
Mhm.
So Jefferson for Dewey and Madison for Lippmann.
Yeah.
So they are really
Okay.
present in the book, but not the entire American history because it's so complicated and so exotic for us French
Yeah.
that it
It's
was
exotic, isn't it?
yeah, it was the beginning of the world, but we have to continue, and you are totally right. But you know that the history of liberalism is so complex, so
Right, right.
so it's totally passionate, in fact. But so I was focused on this, Madison and Jefferson.
But they agree on 90%.
Mhm.
Jefferson and
Yeah, but
Madison
you
agree
know-
about 90%.
Yeah, but you know that after we have made like a myth to have a conflict, and Dewey and Lippmann replay this conflict.
They don't agree quite 90%, but
Yeah,
they
yeah.
agree on a lot of things.
Yeah,
It's true.
yeah, oh, yeah. And yes, Lippmann is very interesting because his program is similar to ours. So he wants to save democracy, an authoritarian version of democracy, to escape fascism, Nazism, and so on. So the only way is to have an authoritarian version of democracy and to control those inept masses by several techniques. So education and manufacture of consent and media and electoral dispositions and so on. But my idea is that the dominant way of think now in elites in the world is Lippmannian. So the idea was to challenge this philosophically with hard arguments. And that's why I was very, very excited by the arguments of the life, of the future of life. Because we are in an ecological crisis. So
One of the differences, though, between Jefferson and Madison seems to be very much the difference between Lippmann and Dewey.
But it's so much clearer in the case of Hamilton and Jefferson than it is in the case of Madison
Okay.
yes, Hamilton
and Jefferson.
Madison.
So
Yeah.
Hamilton is closer to Lippmann, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Lippmann
fair enough.
I mean,
loved
Hamilton's the
Hamilton.
elitist.
Yeah.
Hamilton's the one who doesn't trust the mob.
Right,
Uh,
okay.
Madison semi-trusts the mob, but maybe that's your point. Is that Madison is actually, because Hamilton is so obviously an objectionable elitist.
Yes, you're right.
But Madison is a less objectionable elitist,
The
and
evil-
Jefferson just hammers him on that elitism. He won't put up with it. And Madison is like, but I'm not really an elite.
Yeah, it's true. The
And he
real
isn't.
hero is Hamilton. The real Lippmann
Yeah.
hero is Hamilton, but with
Yeah.
Madison in the mythology of Lippmann,
Yeah.
and in the mythology of Dewey is Jefferson.
So why did you choose Madison then?
Because of the text, you know, I have to see my footnotes. I don't remember.
Because Hamilton would have been an easier choice
Yeah,
for this contrast.
no, you're right. Hamilton
Yeah,
is
yeah,
more
yeah.
central.
So Madison ends up being the creeping Hillary Clinton, whereas you can always see Hamilton coming. You can't see Madison coming because it's a crypto elitism.
That's because he
Yeah.
changed his ideas.
That's true. He did change his
Yeah,
ideas.
we
Yeah.
adapt.
He agreed entirely with Hamilton until he listened to Jefferson a little bit.
Let me see. Hamilton, okay.
Oh, she's checking her.
No,
phone.
Madison just once,
Okay.
and Hamilton a lot of.
Yeah, okay, so there's a lot of Hamilton in there. He's a
But
more
I remember
obvious
some text
association
of
with
Madison.
Lippmann. And we, to this day, Barbara, you wouldn't necessarily know this, but pretty typically, we ask one another, is your liberalism more Hamiltonian or more Jeffersonian? And Hamilton is going to mean a kind of centralized economics,
Yes, of
centralized
course.
government power, fair play, all the rules that you're talking
You know-
about,
Yeah.
intelligent in the sense of some very sophisticated
Yeah.
finance, and then you got Jefferson, who trusts none of this. But I'm not sure how much Jefferson is really like Dewey.
Dewey split the difference.
Sorry.
Jefferson's too individualist.
I like Hamiltonianism influenced by Jeffersonianism.
There you go. Okay. So
Hamiltonian
in other
government-
words, you like Madison.
He said, I want Hamiltonian government with Jeffersonian means. So he split the difference.
Okay, okay. But you know, two French people, Denis Lacorne, you don't know Denis Lacorne? And another one who's very famous, Bernard Manin, don't know?
No, you'll have to teach us.
No, and those two scholars have made a lot of work on this Hamiltonian elitism and so on. Bernard Manin very well. But yeah. But it's exotic for France.
Exotic.
I'm not into philosophy, but I have an ongoing concern that relates to what you've been discussing. The lifting up of the masses through education and improvement in health. But if we're in the midst of, and I fully believe that that's a wonderful short-term, long-term goal, but if we're in the midst of an ecological crisis that's pushing us towards policies that ignore the masses, how do we lift them up quickly enough?
Do you understand the question?
Yes, he wants to know how we change things quickly enough to keep everything from going to hell.
Thank you.
Yeah, the contradiction between the complexity of the task.
Well, the
And
masses
the
are
urgent.
following Donald Trump,
Yeah.
if there is such a thing as the masses. And how does one reach, never mind the followers of Donald Trump, how about the people who aren't doing anything? How do you reach them fast enough to keep everything from going to hell?
I understand. So when you have a vision of politics as a global world plan, because of the urgency, you are paralyzed. Paralyzed. Okay? See, you don't have any
Can't do
plan.
anything about it.
Okay?
Too big.
So what I say here is the Deweyan idea is to work here and now on the with the experimental democratic way, and that's all.
Okay.
I can't imagine another possibility.
Well, Darwin's theories bring us to a situation where I've always got, from my reading, the impression that it's a very generally slow process, sometimes maybe sudden changes, but not something that we can count on or manipulate to happen rapidly. I've gotten the impression we have to think in many generations, but we're in crisis now. We
I
can't.
understand. The Darwinian model is slow. It's a gradualism. Okay, Lippmann and Dewey take Darwinian revolution in account, but they thought about the rupture, the difference with Darwinian framework. And one of the rupture is the acceleration and the difference of rhythms. So I think that the things can go very fast, in fact. For example, the collapse of neoliberalism that I diagnose, it's my diagnosis, is very, very fast, in fact. 5 years ago, neoliberalism has a total hegemony. And I thought that it was like this, certainly 1 century, And now it is very, very fast. So the things can change very fast. We have to participate to the changements and not to reflect if it's possible or not.
It's
That
happening.
is the problem
The
of
masses are going to have to do
intellectual.
something.
intellectual professions
God only
are
knows what.
always reflect, is it possible or not, is it reasonable or not. No. Now we have to participate in mobilization. And it is the case. In France, for example, you have people, intellectual profession, they are on strike. It's crazy.
You're on strike.
I am on strike. It's the first time of my life. It's a moment very strange. So the yellow jackets come in the assembly in the university. They wanted to vote for Marine Le Pen, and now maybe they will not vote for Marine Le Pen. So things can change. Marine Le Pen, you know, the fascist party. Things can change very fast, in fact. But they can change only here and now, and not with a global plan. It's not sufficient, okay, but it's the beginning.
My focus is more on the pragmatic, practical side of how do we improve education and health in a short period rather than over many generations.
Yeah, but the first thing is to resist to the neoliberal destruction to health and education in our hospitals, universities and schools.
Okay.
It's a question of survival, you know.
Okay. Thanks.
And it's the first step. And after maybe we will articulate ourselves with other cities, with other countries, in another scale. But the beginning is a pragmatic, is the pragmatic lesson that we have to begin by our way of life.
Thank you.
I never saw our university as the victim of neoliberalism until this week. Troubles we're having at SIU might be traceable to neoliberal tax policy. I thought it might be our fault. It might not be.
Ronnie Duggar wrote a book in the 1960s called Our Invaded Universities. It was basically about that
In the 60s.
in the 60s.
My. Universities are being defunded, and that would happen regardless of whether Trump was in control
It's a long
or Hillary.
The golden age,
Starts with Reagan.
golden age of American universities is long over.
Yeah, I can see that, but I had thought that I had not thought of it in light of neoliberalism until just now. I mean, until the last 2 days when Barbara showed up, and I start thinking, the problem with SIU has to do with neoliberalism.
I don't know, I mean, if you look at her historical timeline back in the 30s and then coming into World War II, and you see just explosion of public universities, training GIs,
Yeah.
and then successions of GIs and whatnot, and putting them out in various engineering and technical and educational situations.
So there was an explosion, but what happened?
It outgrew itself.
Well, maybe it was never sustainable. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know, I mean, if you're gonna make an analogy to the
We couldn't do it in healthcare, what we did in the
evolution, the biology,
universities.
the evolution, if you keep growing and growing and growing and you kind of outgrow your resources, then it collapses.
Surely that
Like if
happened.
you've got critters in a petri dish and they
Yeah.
all just.
Our petri dish got too full in the American university.
What is typical in neoliberal is to change the meaning of education. Education is no more emancipation or critique or I don't know what. Education is to produce adaptability, mobility in a competitive world with Malthusian situation, the rareté of resources. So when all the schools and all the universities are producing these agents, and that's the case in the Western world, we are in a neoliberal transformation of education, and that is what we have to fight against.
How
It's
did
not very
how
English.
did it produce you?
Sorry?
You and me. How did that
Because
system
it's
produce
a
us?
very, very good question. And I have an answer.
Okay.
Because the reality is not entirely neoliberal. The reality is mixed with neoliberalism, ultraliberalism, social democracy, enlightenments, and so on. You know, the reality is an archaeological mix of all those heritage, and that's a good thing. So we can, like cactus in desert, find little bit water to survive. You understand? When you have the chance, the luck, when you are lucky and your family gave you some force of resistance. But the tendency, for me, was a neoliberal transformation of my institution. And I've seen all the steps. And now, in France, my diagnosis is absolutely shared now. 2 years ago, to speak about neoliberal was to be radical left. Now, all the radio, everyone are speaking about neoliberalism. Not because of me, but because of several people like me. You understand? So, I think this is the time to mobilize, mobilization of intellectual professions, and that is the case in France.
All right, maybe one more question before we consign ourselves to alcohol. Yes.
Okay. I want to ask a question, but I'm not that much in philosophy or anything. So I failed a couple of classes. So. But you said right now you want to go up with the fast of like growing of technology, and you mentioned that you guys want to go up like with the fast growth of technology and like technology and artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask you, when you said that, is it a problem that right now artificial technology that human knows about? I think human knows more about artificial technology, and for example, we know about medicine, how we cure people and a lot of things. But for example, the feelings of a human, are we still short in like for example, our sense, like how do we sense stuff? How do we feel stuff like a human sense?
I don't understand the question.
I do.
Okay.
Do we currently know enough to address the deeper human issues? Never mind the healing technology, never mind the educational technology. The question is whether or not we know enough right now to address the deeper human center. What makes us human? The affective, the emotional, the feeling, the sort of, the place where the adaptations come from. Never mind our technological knowledge, what do we know about who we really are? Is it enough?
The knowledge is always very partial, okay? It's not a problem. We don't have to be in a savoir absolu like Hegel.
We don't have to know everything about ourselves to know something.
Yeah.
But the question is, do we know enough? Not do we have any knowledge, but do we know enough to move forward about who and what we really are? Never mind what they tell us we are.
I think that the proposition of Dewey is very interesting, that we are animals, but original animals who have who have created this organ, which is not intelligent, because most of animals are intelligent, but collective intelligence, which is typically human. And this collective intelligence that Dewey analyzed all this work is linked to affectivity, deeply linked to affectivity. So I think that this pragmatist research are very instructive and they show us a way to political organizations and social life. It's something tiny, but it's something. And in this way, Dewey thought that technology was very, very important because, as you certainly know, he's a thinker of industrial revolution, is admires Bacon, Francis Bacon, and Descartes, and so on. So the idea is to mobilize this technological arsenal, to the service of this intelligence, collective intelligence. And is a thinker of technology, and is always a thinker of the destroying power of technology, of course.
Both at the same time.
Yeah.
The critique of technology is better technology. You have been accused of saying that. We have a great apologist of Dewey's technology in our presence who has been accused of saying that the solution to the problem of technology is better technology.
If you understand technology the proper way, that's true.
I knew you would say that.
I understand that. Dewey is a modern thinker, and we think in homage to modern revolution of industry and technology.
He's not suspicious of that. He's suspicious of our inability to use it
Exactly.
according to cooperative intelligence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he's very, very conscious of the dangers, but he wants absolutely to reappropriate, like Marx, technology.
All right. Well, thank you, Barbara.
Thank you.